I found it on a Tuesday morning. That's the part that always gets me. Not the finding itself, but the day. A Tuesday. The most unremarkable day in the entire week. Not a Monday with its weight of fresh starts. Not a Friday that carries the smell of something about to open. A Tuesday. Gray light coming through the kitchen window, my second cup of coffee going cold on the counter, and a cardboard box sitting in the corner of my living room that I had been carefully ignoring for 3 weeks. I'd told myself I was waiting for the right moment to go through it. That was the story I kept. The truth. And I knew the truth, even when I wasn't ready to say it out loud. The truth was that I knew what was inside that box, and I knew what opening it would cost me. It was the box Diane left. Not Diane herself, of course. Diane was gone. Diane had been gone for 4 months by then, back to her family's house in Vermont. Back to her life that was always going to take her away from mine eventually. Back to the world she came from. The world that had never quite had room for me in it. Or maybe I'd never had room for her. I still wasn't sure which one of us was telling the truth. The box had been sitting there since the afternoon she drove away. She hadn't left it on purpose. She'd left it by accident, or what looked like accident. A few things she'd been keeping at my place over the 6 months she'd been working at the university. Things that didn't make it into her car because she was moving fast. The way people move when they've already said everything there is to say, and staying 1 minute longer would only pull the scab off something that needs to close. I knew what was in it. A sweater. A book of poems she'd lent me in December. Some notes from a project we'd worked on together. A small photograph in a paper frame, the kind you get from a photo booth. The kind you take laughing because you don't expect to look at it later in the way you end up looking at it. That photograph. I hadn't let myself think about that photograph. But on that Tuesday morning, with the gray light and the cold coffee, and the particular quiet of a house that had once been full of someone else's presence, and now held only the ghost of it. On that Tuesday morning, I opened the box. I pushed back the cardboard flaps. I looked down at the sweater folded on top. Oatmeal-colored, soft, the kind of sweater that always looked like it belonged to someone gentle. I lifted it. The smell hit me before anything else. Not perfume exactly. Something more subtle. The specific warmth of her. Cedar, and something like clean linen. And underneath it something that I didn't have a name for, but that my body recognized completely. I sat down on the floor. Right there, next to the box. I didn't plan to. My knees just decided for me. I held the sweater in both hands, and I didn't move for a long time. And then I reached underneath it and found the photograph. It was exactly what I remembered. The two of us in that strip mall photo booth in Northampton, Massachusetts, November, after a conference that had run 3 hours too long and left us both slightly delirious with exhaustion and bad conference hall coffee. It had been Diane's idea. She'd grabbed my sleeve in the parking lot. Come on, just for a second. And I'd followed her the way I always followed her into things I hadn't planned. In the first frame, we were both laughing. Not posed laughing, real laughing. The kind that takes over the face before the brain can organize it into something presentable. I had no idea what was funny. I don't remember. I just remember that she was laughing, and that the laugh made me laugh, and that in that small booth with the curtain pulled and the flash going off, I had thought, I want to stay here, in this exact moment, forever. In the second frame, we were looking at each other. That was all. Just looking. And that second frame was the one I had never been able to stop seeing. I sat on my kitchen floor on a Tuesday morning with that photograph in my hands, and I felt everything I had been carefully not feeling for 4 months come up like a tide. I thought about Diane. I thought about what we were to each other, and what we couldn't be, and why. I thought about the particular weight of a world that keeps two people apart not with cruelty, exactly, but with distance and difference, and the slow accumulation of all the things that are easier not to say. And I thought about the day, 8 months before, when I first walked into her office, and didn't yet know that she was going to change the shape of everything. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. I want to be precise about the beginning. Not because the beginning was dramatic, it wasn't, but because the beginning is the part I've gone over the most, looking for the exact moment where ordinary stopped being ordinary. I was 34. I'd been teaching literature at Whitmore College in Western Massachusetts for 6 years. I liked my job. I liked my office with the window that faced the elm trees. Liked my students with their fierce opinions and their underlined paperback books. Liked the particular smell of a library in the early morning before anyone else arrived. I was settled in the way that feels solid until something comes along and reveals that it was actually only still. The creative writing department shared a floor with mine. We'd been colleagues for years, a group of people I knew well enough to eat lunch with and not well enough to call if something went wrong. That was fine. That was what I'd built. And I'd built it deliberately. Diane Okafor arrived in September. She was a visiting professor, a residency, 1 academic year. She was coming from a fellowship she'd finished in California, and before that she'd been writer-in-residence at 2 different universities, always moving, always somewhere temporary. She'd published 2 novels. I'd read one of them the summer before, not knowing she was coming, just because a colleague had left it in the break room and it had a striking cover. I remembered thinking, whoever wrote this understands how silence works in a room. I did not connect that book to the person who walked into the faculty meeting on the 2nd Thursday of September and introduced herself in a voice that was quiet, but took up space in a way I hadn't expected. She was tall. She had close-cropped hair and wore a dark blazer with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, and she spoke about her work with a directness that wasn't aggressive, but also wasn't apologetic. She said she was interested in the space between what characters know and what they allow themselves to know. She said she thought most people lived in that space permanently. I thought, yes, exactly. I did not think anything else, or I told myself I didn't. Our offices were 3 doors apart. We started saying good morning in the hallway. She made coffee in the department kitchen with a small French press she'd brought from home, and twice in the first month she handed me a cup without asking if I wanted one, which turned out to be the right call both times. In October, she stopped by my open door to ask if I knew where the photocopier paper was kept. I told her. She said, "Thank you. Sorry to bother you." I said, "You're not." She stood in my doorway for another 3 seconds, looking at my bookshelves, and then she said, "Is that the Boland collection?" and pointed at a spine on the middle shelf, and I said yes, and she said, "I haven't read her in years," and I said, "Take it," and she said, "I'll bring it back," and she did, 3 weeks later, with a folded piece of paper tucked into the front cover where she'd written 3 lines she wanted me to read. I unfolded that piece of paper standing at my desk and read it, and there was something that moved inside my chest that I didn't examine. That's what I mean by the beginning. Not a single electric moment. A series of small, ordinary things that were adding up to something I wasn't ready to name. By November, we were having lunch twice a week. Nothing planned. It started because we kept arriving at the faculty lounge at the same time, and it seemed strange not to sit together. Then it continued because we'd gotten into the habit of talking. Not about work exactly, though we talked about work too. About books we were thinking about the way certain sentences settle into the body differently than others, about the strange, specific loneliness of loving language and living in a world that mostly uses it badly. She told me she'd grown up in New Haven, that her mother was Nigerian American, a physician, brilliant, particular in her affections, that her family had expectations she'd spent most of her 30s quietly renegotiating. She said this without complaint, just stated it, the way you state geography. I told her I'd grown up in Ohio, that I'd left for college and never quite gone back, that I'd chosen this life, the teaching, the small New England town, the familiar rhythm of semesters, because it felt like something I could be good at. And being good at things had always felt like the closest I got to being sure of myself. She looked at me when I said that. She had a way of looking at people. A particular quality of attention that made you feel like what you'd just said mattered in ways you hadn't fully worked out yet. "That's a careful way to build a life," she said. I didn't answer. I looked down at my sandwich and thought, I know. I knew. And I knew that she knew I knew. And that was the particular discomfort of being around Diane Okafor. She had a way of making me aware of the things I was pretending not to see. By December, she had become the part of my week I looked forward to most. I noticed this. I noted it the way you note a change in weather. Registered it, filed it, kept moving. It didn't occur to me to examine what it meant. Or it occurred to me once, very briefly, late one evening when I was grading papers and found myself thinking about a thing she'd said at lunch. And I felt something warm move through my chest, and I pushed my chair back from my desk and went to make tea and stood in my kitchen for a while looking out the window at the dark. I didn't think the word. I made the tea. I went back to the papers. I was very good at this. I had been doing it for a long time. The conference in Northampton was in November, but the thing that actually broke something open in me happened 3 weeks before that, on a Friday afternoon in October, when I went to return a book Diane had lent me and found her crying. Not dramatically, not with noise. She was sitting at her desk with her jacket on, like she'd been about to leave and then hadn't been able to. And her face was turned toward the window, and her eyes were wet, and she wasn't making a sound. I should have knocked. I had knocked, actually, lightly, and she'd said, "Come in," in a voice that gave nothing away, and I'd pushed the door open and seen her. And then I didn't leave. I stood there with the book in my hands and I said, "Hey." She turned to look at me. She didn't try to hide it. That was one of the things about Diane. She didn't manage her vulnerability the way most people manage it, as an inconvenience to be resolved quickly before anyone notices. She just looked at me with wet eyes and said, "I just got off the phone with my mother." I nodded. I put the book down on her desk. I sat in the chair across from hers, and I waited. She didn't say much. She said her mother had been clear. Again, apparently it was not the first time. That the residency, the constant moving, the life Diane had built around her writing, was not the life her mother had imagined for her. That there was an expectation of return, a particular kind of return, the kind that comes with stability and proximity and a life that fits inside a certain frame. "She doesn't say it like a demand," Diane said. "She says it like concern. She says she loves me and she worries, and I know she does. And I know that makes it harder, not easier. Because you can't be angry at someone who loves you," I said. She looked at me. "Exactly. Because you can't be angry." We sat there for a while. The light was going gold outside the window, late afternoon in October, the elm trees starting to thin out toward the sky. She looked at the trees. I looked at her. And I felt something I did not have a name for. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even pure sympathy, though that was part of it. It was something more precise. A recognition. Like hearing a piece of music that describes something you'd thought was only happening inside you. I understood her weight. I understood carrying a life that didn't quite match what the people who loved you had expected. I understood the specific grief of not being able to be angry because the love was real. I did not tell her this. I said, "I'm sorry. That's a hard conversation to have." She nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She said, "I'm okay." And then she looked at me and said, "Thank you for not leaving." 3 words. I'm going to say that again. Thank you for not leaving. And something in my chest pulled tight in a way that I tried very hard to interpret as compassion, and nothing more. After that, something shifted between us. Not dramatically. There was no moment either of us named or acknowledged. But the texture of our time together changed. It became more careful and also more open, which sounds contradictory, but isn't. Like we were both more aware that there was something real happening and more cautious about what to do with it. She started coming to my office to work sometimes. She brought her laptop and I brought mine, and we sat in the same room writing our own separate things, and neither of us commented on how comfortable it was. I was aware of her the entire time, not in a distracting way, but in the way you're aware of a fire in a room, the warmth of it, the light it changes. I noticed details I hadn't been cataloging before and now couldn't stop. The specific rhythm of her typing. She typed fast in bursts and then went still. The way she absently turned her pen over in her fingers when she was thinking. The fact that she always took off her earrings and set them on the corner of whatever surface she was working on, 2 small gold hoops, and put them back in when she was leaving. I noticed all of this. I told myself I was just observant by nature. I was a reader. I noticed things. One afternoon, this was in early November, 3 weeks before Northampton, we were working in my office and the heat stopped. The old building, its systems always questionable. It was cold fast. I had a blanket on the arm of my reading chair, one of those things you accumulate in a cold climate office. And I said, "There's a blanket if you need it." And she said, "Thank you," and took it and wrapped it around her shoulders. And then she said, "You should have half," and shifted the blanket open like an invitation. I looked at her. She looked at me. And I got up from behind my desk and went and sat beside her on the small office couch, and we pulled the blanket across both our shoulders and went back to our work. We sat there for 2 hours. Our arms were touching. Neither of us moved apart. The office was cold, and outside the window it started to snow, the first real snow of the year, and I remember the particular quality of the silence between us. Not empty, not awkward, but full of something neither of us was going to name. When I got home that night, I stood in my shower for much longer than usual. I wasn't thinking consciously, or I was thinking consciously, but in the way where you refuse to follow the thought to its conclusion, where you keep arriving at the edge and stepping back. I thought about her shoulder against mine, the specific warmth of it. I turned the shower hotter. I thought, she's leaving in May. She's a visiting professor. She's here for 1 year, and then she's gone. Back to another residency, another fellowship, another university in another part of the country. She has a mother in New Haven who wants her to come home. She has a world that doesn't overlap with mine in any lasting way. The barrier isn't imaginary. It's structural. It's real. I thought all of this as if it were a protective argument. And underneath it, smaller and more honest, one word surfacing and submerging before I could look at it directly. I turned the shower off. I dried off. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. The next morning, she was at the coffee maker when I arrived. She handed me a cup. She said, "Thanks for the blanket." I said, "Anytime." She smiled at the coffee in her hand. I walked to my office and closed the door and sat at my desk for a full minute before I could organize myself into the person who was going to teach 2 sections of Victorian literature. The person who wasn't thinking what I was thinking. The person who was fine. I was so busy being that person that I almost missed what was happening. Almost. Because the thing about a feeling you refuse to name is that it doesn't wait for your permission. It just keeps building. It fills in the space around the words you're not saying until the shape of it is visible to everyone who's paying attention. I noticed my colleague Renata watching me watch Diane at a faculty lunch one afternoon. Renata said nothing. But when our eyes met, she looked at me with an expression that was gentle and also slightly pained, and I looked away first. I was not as invisible as I thought, and neither was what I felt. I started being more careful, more deliberate about not being too careful, which is its own kind of giveaway when you start managing the naturalness of yourself. I answered Diane's messages slightly slower. I came to lunch only once a week instead of twice. I gave myself reasons. I was busy. The semester was demanding. I had papers to grade. She noticed. I could tell she noticed because she said nothing. And Diane was not the kind of person who said nothing about things that mattered. The silence cost both of us something. I felt the cost every day, that small daily subtraction, and I told myself it was necessary. It was the responsible thing. It was the only thing that made sense given the distance that was coming, given the structures that separated us, given everything. Then she knocked on my door on a Wednesday morning and said, "I have 2 spots at this conference in Northampton. It's a day trip. Do you want to come?" And I said yes before I finished thinking about it. Northampton in November is the color of old books. That's the only way I know how to describe it. The light goes amber early. The streets narrow between old brick buildings. And everything has a quality of something preserved. Not frozen, but tended. We drove up together in her car, a 3-hour drive from Whitmore. And I spent the first 40 minutes looking out the passenger window telling myself I was just going to be present. Just going to be a colleague and a friend, and someone who had her feelings in order. She played music low, something I didn't recognize, instrumental, a single piano threading through silence. She drove with one hand on the wheel, and the other resting near the gear shift. I was aware of her hands the entire drive. I was aware of the space between her hand and mine on the armrest between us, maybe 3 inches. I watched the road. She said, at some point around the New Hampshire border, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. "You've been a little different lately." I waited. Not in a bad way, more careful. She glanced at me and then back to the road. "I just notice it." I said, "I've been busy, the semester." She didn't argue. She said okay in a voice that clearly meant she heard something different but wasn't going to press it. And that was the thing about Diane. She understood where the edges were. She didn't push through. She waited. I was grateful for that, and also quietly undone by it, because the waiting felt like a room being held open. And every day I didn't walk through it, something accumulated in the doorway. The conference was fine. We went to 2 panels and a reading. Ate lunch at a sandwich place where she stole half my chips without asking, which was so naturally easy between us that it made my throat tighten. On the way back, we stopped in town for coffee because the conference had ended early and there was still an hour of light left. She said, "Let's walk for a bit." We walked down Main Street, past the bookshops and the small galleries, and then she stopped in front of the photo booth and said, "Come on," and grabbed my sleeve, and I followed her in. I have already told you about the photograph, but what I haven't told you is what happened after. We came out of the booth into the cold gray of late afternoon, and she was still laughing at something. I can't remember what. And I was looking at her, and she caught me looking, and the laughter slowed down, and we stood there in the parking lot with the photograph strip in her hand, and the wind moving her collar, and she looked back at me in a way that was not the way people who are just colleagues look at each other. It lasted only a few seconds. And then she looked down at the photograph and said, "We look like people who are happy." And her voice had something underneath the word happy that I didn't know what to do with. I said, "Yeah, we do." We got back in the car. We drove home mostly quiet. She dropped me at my front door at 9:30, and I got out and said thank you for the day, and she said any time, always, and I closed the car door and walked into my house. I stood in my dark kitchen for a long time. I thought, she's leaving in May. 6 months. 6 months and she'll be in another city, another university, another visiting residency, and the life she has, the expectations of it, the pull of family, the particular shape of the world she carries. That life doesn't intersect with mine in any lasting way. The math of it is unfair, but it is not a mystery. We are not in the same situation. We are not operating from the same coordinates. I thought all of this clearly and deliberately, and I believed it. and I still lay awake until 2 in the morning thinking about the way she had looked at me in that parking lot. After Northampton, something changed that I could feel but not see. We were gentler with each other, more careful, but in a new way. Not the careful of pulling back, but the careful of not wanting to break something. We still ate lunch. We still worked in the same space sometimes. But there was something between us now that we were both navigating around, and neither of us had named it, and the longer we didn't name it, the bigger it got. My colleague Renata cornered me one afternoon in February, in the break room, when it was just the two of us. She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Fine. Good. Busy." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said quietly, "She's leaving in May." I kept my face still. "I know. Okay." She poured her coffee. I just wanted to say it, in case it was useful to hear someone else say it out loud. She left before I could figure out how to answer. I stood in the break room alone. The coffee maker dripped. Outside the window, the campus was winter bare, the elms stripped to their bones against a white sky, and I thought, everyone can see it. Everyone can see it except the two of us, and that's only because we have decided not to look. I started doing the math obsessively. 6 months becomes 4 months becomes 3. Diane had given a reading of new work in February. I'd gone, sat in the back, watched her at the podium speaking about the particular violence of silence in intimate relationships, how silence is not neutral, how it accumulates weight the longer it's held. I'd listened to her read those words and felt them land in my body like something I'd written myself and forgotten. I thought about what Renata had said. I thought about what Diane had been circling. I thought about the 6 months of lunches and the blanket in the cold office and the photograph in November. I thought about how the particular weight of a feeling doesn't care whether the conditions are right for it. And I thought about her mother in New Haven, who wanted her home. About the fellowship she'd been offered in Chicago for next fall. She'd mentioned it once, casually, and I had filed it under things I was not going to think about. About the life she had before Whitmore, and would have after. The whole geography of a person that exists outside the small shared space you've built with them. I thought about the sweater she left in my office one evening and retrieved the next morning, and how in the 15 hours between leaving and retrieving it, I had picked it up from the chair she'd left it on and held it for a moment before putting it back. I thought about all of this, and I did not say a word of it. March arrived, then early April, and the sense of something ending was in the air the way spring is in the air before it actually arrives. You can't see it yet, but you can feel the pressure of it shifting. We were having lunch one afternoon in the first week of April, and she was quieter than usual. She had her hands around her coffee mug and she was looking at it instead of at me. And after a long silence, she said, "My mother wants me to come home before Chicago." "Okay," I said. "She's planned things. A week in New Haven before I start packing for Illinois. She means well. You know how that is." "I know." Another silence. And then she said, without looking up from her coffee, "I keep thinking there are things I should say before I go. And then I think about why saying them is complicated, and I don't say them." My heart went quiet. I said, "What makes it complicated?" She looked at me then, and there was something in her face, careful and open at the same time, the way her face got when she was about to say something true. And she said, "You. Mostly." I held very still. She said, "I don't want to make things harder for you, or for me. I know the math of it." I said, "The math. The distance. The life I keep moving around in. The things I can't offer that are—" She stopped, started again. "I don't want to say something that opens something that then has to close because of circumstances neither of us chose." I thought, this is the most honest conversation I've ever been in. I thought, I am terrified. I said, I think I know what you're not saying. She said, I think you do too. And we sat there across from each other, two women in a faculty lounge with our coffee going cold, with every word that mattered suspended between us like smoke, and neither of us said it, and the silence was the heaviest thing I'd ever held. She left 3 weeks later. She packed her car on a Wednesday. I helped carry boxes. She gave back the Boland collection. She gave me the photograph from the strip, the second frame, just the second frame, which she must have cut off the strip at some point without me seeing. She pressed it into my hand in my doorway and said, "Something to keep." And I said, "Okay." And she held my hand for one more second than the moment technically required, and then she got in her car, and she left. And I stood on my front porch, and I watched her go, and I did not call her back. I put the photograph in the cardboard box with her sweater and the book of poems, and I closed the box and put it in the corner of my living room, and I left it there for 3 weeks, while I learned how to stop listening for her steps in the hallway 3 doors down. But before we continue, if you made it this far, it's because you know this feeling. That specific weight of something you never let yourself say all the way. That arithmetic of a love that seems impossible on paper, even when it feels inevitable in the body. If this story is landing somewhere real for you, hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second and it tells YouTube that this kind of story matters. And it helps me keep bringing you more of these. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and ring the bell. That way you'll know the moment a new story arrives. And I need you to tell me something in the comments. Have you ever been in a room with someone, feeling everything, and chosen not to say it? Because the timing was wrong, or the world between you was too big, or you were scared that naming it would make the ending real? Tell me. Write it down. I read every single one. And tell me what city you're watching from. I'll leave you a heart. Okay. Back to our story. Because this is where everything shifts. I opened the box on a Tuesday morning, and I sat on my kitchen floor with the sweater in my lap and the photograph in my hands, and I let myself feel it. All of it. The particular grief of it. Not the dramatic kind, not the grief that announces itself with noise and theater, but the quiet kind. The kind that settles. That says, you love this and you let it go because you were afraid, and now she is in Chicago, and you are here, and the distance is not a metaphor. It is actual miles. And you chose this. I sat with that for a long time. The coffee on the counter went from warm to cold. The gray light outside shifted to the slightly more decisive gray of mid-morning. My downstairs neighbor started her morning routine. I could hear her through the floor, the familiar percussion of her day. And I thought, what exactly was I afraid of? Not the loving, not the feeling itself. I had felt it for months, and it hadn't killed me. Not even the loss, because I was in the loss right now and still breathing. I was afraid of the math of it, the distance, the moving life she led, the family that pulled her in a different direction, the sense that wanting something real with her would mean wanting something that the world wasn't structured to support. I sat there and I turned that math over in my hands like the photograph. And I thought, but the math was always true. The math was true in October and November and December and March. And I had stayed anyway. I had felt it anyway. The math had not prevented the feeling. It had just prevented me from being honest about it. I thought about the day she'd said, "There are things I should say before I go, and I don't say them because of what happens after." I had heard that as, "This is impossible, so I won't speak it." But sitting on my kitchen floor on a Tuesday in late August, 4 months later, I heard it differently. I heard, I wanted to say something and I needed to know if the saying was worth the cost. And I had sat across from her and not answered the question. Not because I didn't know the answer. I knew the answer then the same as I knew it now. Here, with the photograph in my hands and the sweater smelling of cedar and something warm and specific that I would have recognized in any room. I knew because the wanting had not gone anywhere. It had simply gone quiet, the way a river goes quiet in winter, still there, still moving, just underneath a surface you'd learned not to test. I had let her leave not because I didn't love her, but because I was certain that love wasn't enough to hold against the weight of circumstance. But here's the thing. I hadn't let myself think all the way through. She had said she kept thinking about things she should say. She had handed me the photograph. She had held my hand 1 second too long on the doorstep. She had been having the same conversation in reverse, and neither of us had answered. I set the photograph on the kitchen floor. I looked at it. I picked up my phone. I opened her contact. Diane O. A little book emoji beside her name because I'd put it there in October thinking it was subtle. I looked at the screen for a long time, and then I thought, what is the cost of saying it? Real cost, not imagined. Not the cost I'd been inflating for months out of something I was calling practicality, but was actually fear. The real cost. The distance was real. Chicago to Massachusetts was real miles. Her life was genuinely unsettled, built around movement. Her mother's expectations were genuine pressures she carried. And also, she had been 3 doors down from me for 9 months, and I had never once asked whether the distance was something we could work with, rather than a verdict we had to accept. I had made the math for both of us and handed her the result without ever showing her the work. That was not protection. That was something else. I picked up the phone. I typed, I found the sweater, and the photograph. I put the phone face down on the kitchen floor beside me. My heart was doing something irregular. I breathed in. I breathed out. Her response came 11 minutes later. I know because I watched every one of those minutes tick past. I've been thinking about those, she wrote. And then, after a pause that I could feel across 700 miles, how are you? I held the phone. I thought, here it is. The moment you either step back from the edge again, or you stop pretending the edge isn't there. I wrote, I've been sitting on my kitchen floor for an hour holding your sweater, and realizing I made a decision for both of us that I should have asked you about. First, I think I owe you a conversation we didn't actually have. 11 minutes again. I watched the 3 dots appear and disappear and appear. Then, I have 3 weeks between my fellowship ending and the fall semester starting. I was going to go to New Haven for all of it, but I've been thinking about Massachusetts. My breath did something complicated. I typed, you should come. She wrote, okay. And then, I want to say something now. While we're here. I wrote, okay. She wrote, I didn't leave because I stopped feeling it. I left because I thought you were choosing the math. And I decided to respect that. But I've been in Chicago for 4 months, and I've thought about October and November and that drive to Northampton approximately every single day, and I think I made the same mistake you made. I decided things without asking. I read it twice. Then I typed, I know. I did the same thing. A longer pause. Then, so, 3 weeks in September. I wrote, 3 weeks in September. I set the phone down. I stayed on the kitchen floor. Outside the window, the gray had given way to something lighter. Not dramatic. Not a cinematic sunbreak. Just the ordinary way late morning lifts the light in August in Massachusetts. The coffee on the counter was completely cold now, and I didn't care. I held the photograph. I looked at the second frame, the 2 of us looking at each other. I thought, this is not a solution. There is still the distance. There is still her mother in New Haven, and the life she moves through, and the specific structural reality of 2 people who do not live inside the same world. Those things are still true. But there was something else also true, which I had been refusing to see. I had spent 9 months in the same building as a woman who made the air in a room feel different, who understood silence the way I'd always wanted someone to understand it, who handed me coffee without asking, and folded herself into a blanket beside me on a cold afternoon, and looked at me in a parking lot in November like I was something she'd been trying to figure out for years. And I had called that a friendship, and built a wall around it, and stood behind it being very careful, and then missed her every single day after she left. The wall was not protecting me. The wall was just making me cold. I got up off the kitchen floor. I put the photograph in my pocket. I put the sweater over the back of my kitchen chair, draped it there where I could see it. I poured the cold coffee down the drain and started making a new cup. And I thought, 3 weeks in September. And for the first time in months, something in my chest loosened. She arrived on a Friday evening in the first week of September. I heard her car in the driveway from inside the house. I'd been trying to read for the last hour and not succeeding, and I put the book down and took a breath. I heard the car door. I heard her footsteps on the path. I heard the knock. I opened the door. She was standing on my porch with a bag over her shoulder and her hair grown out slightly from the close crop it had been in May. And she looked exactly like herself, which sounds simple but was not simple, because for 4 months I had been constructing her from memory, and all of the constructions had been slightly off in ways I couldn't identify, and now she was here and correcting all of them. She said, "Hi," I said. "Hi," she said. "I brought you something." And she held out a book, a slim collection, new. I didn't recognize the poet. I took it. I looked down at it. I turned it over in my hands. She said, "She's a contemporary. I read her on the way here. Page 41. I looked up at her. She was watching me with that particular quality of attention, that presence, the way she had of making you feel seen, not in the uncomfortable way, but in the way of being genuinely looked at, without agenda, without assessment, just, there you are. I said, "Come in." She came in. She set her bag by the door. She looked around my kitchen, at the plant I'd managed not to kill, at the books stacked on the table, at the chair with the sweater still draped over the back. She looked at the sweater for a moment without saying anything. Then she looked at me. I said, "I couldn't put it away." She nodded slowly. She said, "I know." We made dinner. That's what we did. She was better at cooking than I am, and she knew it, and I let her take over my kitchen without a word, which should have been awkward, and wasn't. She put music on from her phone, the same instrumental she'd played on the drive to Northampton. I sat at the kitchen table with the book of poems, and I found page 41. I read the poem twice. It was about a winter room, about 2 people in a winter room who are being careful with each other, about how care can become a kind of cage if you're not watching, about the moment one of them opens a window. I looked up. She was at the stove with her back to me. I said, "Diane." She turned. I said, "I want to do this differently than before. I want to say the things this time." She held still. The stove hissed quietly behind her. I said, "I know the practical things are still true. The distance, your life that moves, all of it. I'm not pretending any of that isn't real." She waited. "But I spent 9 months in the same building with you being very careful about not wanting something, and then 4 months after you left, not wanting it anyway but not having it. And I think..." I stopped, breathed. "I think careful is overrated. I think I'd rather want it honestly and figure out the practical things after." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and sat down in the chair across from mine. She put her hands flat on the table between us. Her hands. Those particular hands. She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something to you for about 7 months." I said, "Say it." She looked at her hands, then at me. I think I knew somewhere around October, she said. And then I spent all the rest of the time trying to decide if telling you was fair, given the circumstances, given the math. A small, wry sound. The math. I know the math, I said. I know you do. And? She looked at me steadily. She said, and I think the math only controls you if you let it. A silence that was not empty. I looked at her. She looked at me. And I thought about the second frame of the photograph, the one she'd cut off the strip and pressed into my hand on the doorstep. Two people looking at each other. Just that. Nothing more and nothing less than, I see you and you see me, and whatever this is, it is real. I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers. She didn't move. And then she turned her hand over, slowly, and our fingers settled together. And we sat like that in my kitchen with the stove still on, and the music still playing, and the window above the sink showing the early dark of September. And neither of us said anything for a long time. We didn't need to. The dinner burned slightly at the edges. We didn't notice until it was already done. We ate it at the kitchen table, talking about Chicago and the fellowship and the poet on page 41, and she told me about her mother, and I told her about my terrible summer of not sleeping well, and at some point, we moved to the couch and kept talking, and I lost track of when the talking slowed into the particular comfortable quiet of two people who don't need to fill all the space. She fell asleep first, around midnight, with her head tipped back against the cushion and her hands loose in her lap. I looked at her. I thought, this is not a resolution. This is a beginning of a thing that will be complicated and require conversation and probably more of that math I've been trying to avoid. It is not simple. It will not be. And I thought, I am 34 years old, and I spent 9 months not letting myself want something real, and I have exactly no interest in spending any more time doing that. I got a blanket from the bedroom. I draped it over her carefully, the way you do when you don't want to wake someone. She stirred slightly. She didn't open her eyes, but she pulled the blanket closer. I sat back down beside her. The apartment was quiet. September pressed against the windows, cool and dark and slightly sweet. I picked up the book of poems from the coffee table. I found page 41 again. I read it in the low lamplight. The poem ended with someone opening a window. Not dramatically, not in a grand gesture, just pressing the latch, letting the air in. I closed the book. I set it on the cushion between us. The sweater was still on the kitchen chair, visible through the doorway. The photograph was in my pocket. The box was gone. I'd broken it down that morning, folded the cardboard flat, put it by the recycling. I didn't need the box anymore. There are things you spend years building walls around because you've told yourself the math doesn't work. And then one day you stop long enough to realize the wall was never keeping anything out. It was keeping you in. We figured out the practical things. We figured them out slowly, imperfectly, with honesty, and more than a few hard conversations. We are still figuring them out. That is the real version of this. Not the clean version, the real one. But that September morning, I woke up before she did and made coffee, and looked out my kitchen window at the elm trees. And for the first time in almost a year, the quiet felt like mine. If this story touched something in you, type quiet in the comments, so I know you made it here with me. And if you want another story that knows what it costs to finally stop running from yourself, it's on your screen right now. With love, always. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description.